to quickly introduce here our panelists. We have Nick Pickles here to my left, who is the head of public policy and government for Twitter. We have Ida Auken, who is with the Danish Social Liberal Party and has been for the last, I believe, 10 years actively involved in Danish political life. She's the former minister for environment and is currently the spokesperson for environment, business, and IT for her party. MJ Akbar, who has a very distinguished history within the political and literary life of India and is currently Minister of State for External Affairs. And Michael Stewart, who is Global Vice Chairman at Edelman and also responsible for Edelman Intelligence. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us here today in London on the one day that I think everyone is not on an airplane or going to and from meeting with constituents. Our topic on trust, I think, is a fascinating one because we tend to only talk about trust when we feel it's a problem. We tend to not sit around talking about how wonderful it is that we really feel a deep sense of trust with one another, with our institutions, with our leaders, when everything is swimming along supposedly as normal. But 2017 doesn't seem like a normal year to many of us in this room, and so it's no surprise that Chatham House has decided to identify trust as a key core area of conversation. Now, I have my background in the Silicon Valley at Google, YouTube, and Facebook. And I remember back in the old days when it was so much more innocent thinking about the relationship of people on social media, people on the internet, and trust. The 1st of April is widely known in many countries as April Fool's Day. It's the Silicon Valley's favorite holiday. April Fool's Day is when you play jokes on other people, you have a little bit of fun. And we used to love this at Google and YouTube. We'd sit around thinking about what kind of jokes we could play on everybody using the products. And the reason we could do that is because the trust coefficient was so high at the time in the Silicon Valley. The idea being that if you hopped on Google and looked something up, you were going to get the best possible result. The spam filters were getting so good that you could trust the information that was coming into your inbox. And I couldn't help but think, as I've been mulling over our conversation on trust, how much has changed. Do you play with trust on the internet anymore? Or is that starting to feel a little bit sinister? The joke, of course, around April Fool's Day in the Silicon Valley is that it's the only day that people stop and think whether they should trust what they read on the internet. But moving along, I think it helps us to frame everything we're discussing in terms of trust as both evolutionary and a balance. And when is the balance is right, and when does the balance feel a bit? When it comes to the national level, you do have some positive stories to tell about trust. One country in particular. Yes. Can you share with us where I might be going with this leading question?
Absolutely. So MJ will be very happy to hear this. Of the 28 countries, there is one country for whom it is true that they trust all institutions, they believe the system is working for them, they trust their leaders, and they are on a low level of fear, and that's India. And is the only country that stands out in that regard.
I'm happy but not surprised.
Good to hear.
So MJ, take us from there. You're happy but not surprised. Tell us why you're not surprised.
I wanted to shift the compass a little, with your permission. Having read the brief and having discussed with you. I think the biggest challenge from this absence of trust, we are missing it a little. It is not absence of trust in institutions, which is going to lead to great disorder, but absence of trust or growing distrust in the nation state itself. Today, in Spain, I don't think the people who are asking for independence in Catalonia want to change the parliamentary system or want to change democracy, but they've lost their faith in the Spanish state. You are sitting in a city where the country lost its faith in an imagined, real or imagined superstate. Scotland, very recently. So we are seeing a rise of, for a variety of reasons, of distrust in the nation state itself. And I do want to make this point, that the idea of a modern nation state actually emerged about 100 years ago, after World War I, when in the vacuum left behind by collapsing empires, a new regime, a new state had to be created. And this was a revolutionary idea came about, where the will of the people became perhaps the most important fact of the emergence of the modern state. Some countries went on to the next logical step of democracy, some didn't. But it was by and large the will of the people. And today we discover that the will of the people is a dynamic reality, which can shift and change and make a continuous demand. And therefore, while the will of the people changes governments, and we are all very happy about that, more or less, unless you are in government, when the will of the people begins to challenge the structure of the state, then we are looking at some very serious disorder. One point that we must address, the biggest challenge to order and the biggest preparation for disorder and even chaos is coming from Salafist Jihadism. And we can't keep that elephant out of this room if we want to discuss the subject. Why? It has a very interesting history. In 1918, for a variety of reasons for which we have no time, every single Muslim in the world was colonized by a European nation. It is quite a remarkable fact, given the pride that Muslims had always had in their political abilities and in their whatever the structures that protect their politics. And then you saw the mass upsurge coming in which challenged colonization. And this was also a tremendous people's project. But then they saw neo-colonization, then they saw a variety of things. Now, surreptitiously, an idea began to get momentum, which was that if the ideas of man have failed, let us try the ideas of God. And that led to the rise of a notion which actually has no history, which was that religion can be the basis of nationalism. And this really found a geography not too far away from our country. And this geography then began to provide sanctuaries towards Islamism, or whatever you want to call it. And in what this spawned, with each failure, the return of what I have described in an essay as the romance of regression, in which an imagined caliphate becomes the answer to all problems. It's completely untrue historically, but the irrational has also been a part, particularly when irrationalism is sponsored by fear or uncertainty. Now, it is a very, very big mistake to think that the terrorists we see everywhere do not have a political agenda. They do have a political agenda. They are challenging the nation state and want to replace it with faith-based space, whether it is caliphate or whatever else it might be. Boko Haram today controls far more space than we actually imagine. And along with this, the use of fear as a potent poison in order to disturb the plural harmony that civilized people and societies have achieved. With great difficulty, it hasn't been an easy achievement. But to inject fear into the environment, with consequences particularly in democracies, which destabilize the nation state, destabilize people-to-people relations, and become a constant threat to the values of civilization that we believe in. I mean, I really don't want to go on this because it's time-consuming, among other things. But I just would like to leave you with some of these thoughts.
So the will of the people, it's so interesting.
better solutions, not pretending that they're perfect, not pretending like we can solve everything. We should bring down some of the expectations. And that might be my interpretation of India, that expectations might also be a little bit lower. I mean, I know how some bureaucrats work in India. I know how they work. I mean, I would say that expectations of meeting a system that delivers on all areas would probably be bigger in some countries than others. That I think one problem is that people have very, very high expectations, and we probably are guilty of that. So maybe also lower expectations a little bit. Tell people that this is difficult. I want to try and solve it, but it is difficult.
So
sorry, may I just?
Yes, please.
I mean, I already know why you're going to be re-elected. But on this low expectations, that in our experience is simply not true. In fact, the better the government, the expectations soar beyond the abilities of government. And that is one of the problems that you'll probably find that in polling as well. And the poor, in fact, who have been left behind, they're asking very serious questions, and they have every right to ask them, which is, how long are you going to deny us? And that is the challenge, that is the foremost single, if I had to suggest a reason, is because at the center and heart of governance is a single, but certainly not small, mission. And we use the word mission in a very, at least the Prime Minister does, in a missionary sense, which is that we have to eliminate this curse of poverty completely. And every single thing, and he says that while the statistics take time, and they will sort themselves out in some form or the other, the macro economic plans will sort themselves out. What have you done each day to improve the quality of life of the poor? So giving a woman a gas cylinder, which can stop the cold smoke from hitting her eyes to the power of something like 100 cigarettes a day, or entering her lungs, giving public facilities by which the toxins in her body, which she had to sort of internalize all this while because there were no toilets available. To make this into a mass program, to make this into a countrywide program, that really is at the heart of governance. And that really, and therefore, the poor are never unrealistic. They don't think that, they're going to transit from a hut into a palace. What they ask is the movement towards, the improvement of my life or not? Right? And therefore, I've always thought that the most pernicious theory for countries like us was the one sent from a few extremely intelligent people in some country called the trickle-down theory. A trickle-down theory basically means that those who have swimming pools will get the waterfall, and those who are dying of thirst will get the trickle. It is not sustainable. The waterfall has to go to the poor who are thirsty. It is the rich who can do, with a few trickles after having seized the waterfalls for heaven knows how many generations. So it is this dynamic, really, which is also the sustaining heart of democracy. If democracy is not about the people, then what is it about?
Well, it's interesting. Interesting, yeah. Tricia. Yeah, I think the mic is just coming here.
I think this is really interesting that you've had this whole panel discussion without mentioning the sort of very big trending word, which is corruption. And I actually think there are brilliant books that have been written in the last 3 or 4 years, and you need just read one of them to understand how endemic and how intractable it is, and it starts, whether it's in Afghanistan and it ends up here, it's all very connected. The money now starts at the top, it trickles to the second layer, and then stops there, goes back up, and then out of the country. And so the type of corruption there is now is all over the world. And perhaps why India and maybe China, there's more of a trust issue with their leaders, is that they are being seen to tackle it very, very aggressively. Whether they have success or not, whether they can even begin to go into those layers is a different thing, but they are being seen that way. Transparency, online living as we do, we know where people are cheating their way through, from Trump to our own governments, to Spain. Spain might be in a very trustful environment with their own government compared to Catalonia. There are a lot of people now who are, waving the flags in Madrid, but it won't be sustainable if Spain does not clean up its act. Every person's got their, fingers in the till. Corruption hasn't been mentioned once, because every time one tries to kind of deal with it, it is just almost impossible to penetrate. What are your opinions on how we move forward on that?
MJ, do you want to start us off, and then Ida perhaps as well?
Yeah, shall I?
Yeah, please.
I couldn't. If there's 150% agreement, then it's 150%. You've actually hit upon or mentioned the fundamental fact that people have truly lost their faith in the elites after what they have experienced. And that's why the effort. Now, let me give you some practical problems that you face. Because when you are actually challenging corruption, as our government is doing at the moment, you are creating very powerful enemies. And those enemies seek many ways of sabotage, of policy. They use all sorts of, including social media, in order. They will never, of course, admit that their anger comes because their corruption at many levels is being challenged. Transparency is being introduced. Transparency at a massive level is being introduced. Gender empowerment is now the most significant element of India's economic policy. But this is creating massive ripples, as you will know from any form of experience. And to hold the electorate's trust while challenging the norm is really requires political communication of the highest order, because without the trust, the government is, the power of a government doesn't lie in the officers. The power of government lies in how much support you get from the people. Right? And actually on this, may I just add one thing which will interest you. When Gandhi came in 1915 back home to India, and this was his first, January 1915, and he went and met a mentor. And that mentor told him that, I believe you want to enter public life. He said, for 1 year, keep your mouth shut and your ears open. And for a year, Gandhi traveled all over without making a single speech, without saying a single word, and listening. Every Monday, he would keep mum. He would keep quiet. That was his day of listening. So
Ida, I know you want to come in. MJ, I just want to really quickly come to you. In addition to some of these questions that have been posed to the panel, you really emphasized the nation state in your opening remarks. But so much of what we read about our lack of trust today has to do with this threat of what is globalization doing for me? Do you reject that theory as one of the primary drivers of mistrust in our world?
The nation state was created as the building block for the architecture of stability. And it wasn't created simply for itself. It was created for the whole world. Right? I mean, it is a modern idea, and it was created for a modern environment. Post-empire, before the nation state, armies decided where the boundaries would end. Today, it's the will of the people which decides. And therefore, from there emerges some very important, I hope, lessons which will address a large number of issues. We don't have time for, I think, specific. But to take up the case of the ISIS, for example, the ISIS will not be defeated only by winning the battle. You have to win the argument. Because this is an age which is going to be determined by what people believe, by the trust in what they believe. And therefore, have we done enough? We've spent heaven knows how many trillions of dollars on the battle. How much actually have we spent on trying to win the argument after the battle? In Afghanistan, people forget that the Taliban was defeated comprehensively. How did it come back to the point of chaos that we see today? Because we didn't win the argument with the poor. We didn't win the argument with next generation. So I think it's extremely important. You know, one of the serious dangers of this combination of religion and nationalism is this is controlled by faith supremacists, people who believe in one faith supremacy, whereas the modern state believes in faith equality. So everyone is an equal before the state. But one of the consequences of faith supremacy as a model for governance is that it leads essentially to a jelly state, which is a state which is inherently unstable. Unlike butter, it doesn't melt away. But like jelly, it keeps shivering all the time. And if you add nuclear weapons to such a state, you get a very toxic jelly state. But sometimes, and in the earlier panel also this was discussed, the possibilities and the potential of the turbulence that we see today is sometimes beyond the ability of imagination to measure the fright and fear.
We're having this conversation in a train station. Trains, of course, are largely connected to the democratization of travel in the 19th century. The middle class started to travel because they could come to a place like this and begin their journey to leave their hometown. And here we're talking about the democratization of information as a potential driver both for the positive and the sinister and negative in terms of how it is that we see and understand the values we wrap around trust and the exercise of building it. Thank you so much to everybody on the panel for joining us. Please do give our panelists a round of applause and enjoy your lunch.